recording for my life.
Okay, there we go. Right, so we're going to play that back.
Play it.
Preparing a recording for my life.
And yours is okay, John?
Yeah.
Red.
Right, so we'll just get rid of that one.
No, that's fine, John.
Got your lovely legs in.
Bit of leg.
Okay. If you,
Okay.
Do you need a drink or anything?
Ready to go?
Do you want a drink or anything,
No,
David?
I'm fine.
You're
I'm
all
fine,
right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm Olga. I'm recording David's biography today.
Okay, put it on there. Right, then off we go. My name's David Pugh. I'm 84 years old, so I was born in 1936. I'm in the Hospice at Isabel at Harlow at the moment to record some highlights of my life. A lot of my life and my family history has been recorded anyway, because in this country we've had consensus records going back way time. What I want to do is to add to the census records and the things that are publicly known about my two families, the Pughs and the Keens, little additions that don't come up. I was born in 1936, just before the war. I'm not quite sure how my parents actually met. I know I was born in St Mary's in Paddington, and very soon we moved to Hayes, which is on the west part of London. The estate I lived on was not a sink estate, as I've described it in the past, but rather an estate of poor people who never really had any money. My father was born in 1901 in obviously desperate circumstances. He was one of 5 or 6 or 7 children, the records will show how many, and he was taken into care at that time when poverty was desperate anyway. And we noticed, because friends of ours had done research on it, that he came in and out of care. And the reason was his mother had him out of care when she could afford it and put him in care when she couldn't. He had a family of maybe 4 or 5 sisters and brothers, and they never really met as a family or knew each other until they were in their 30s. He was put into care and trained in music. It was a pretty harsh environment going into care. They trained you in music, and then as soon as you were 14 or 15 or 16, they put you in the army as a band boy. So you then went in the army with a profession. He could play a tune on most things, but he'd had no family life really. My mother came from a family and she had no real skills. She worked in factories and boxing chocolates and gardens and that sort of stuff. My influence was great with my grandfather on my mother's side, because about the time that I was 4 or 5 or 6, the Great War was on, and my mother used to work in a factory making gun barrels, believe it or not. She would work all day running a home, and then at night they used to run huge lathes turning gun barrels. So, there was a double job there. And I lived on a small estate. My grandmother and grandfather lived just round the corner, and we sort of were brought up in 2 separate houses. School, I can't remember much about my junior school, except that it was actually a very tall building with high windows to stop you looking out and getting any sort of view from outside. It was a school where nobody had ever passed the 11 plus, and true to form, I didn't pass either. I went to a secondary modern school as they were then, but my school days were brilliant. I lived in a long road. At one end of the road was a gravel pit, and it had been dug about 30, 40 years ago. And so it had had time to the ponds to fill in and the trees to mature. And as a group of kids, maybe 10, 15 of us, we ran maybe riot there. We could go and catch birds' eggs and climb trees and have a tremendous time. And this was during the war years. School was a different matter, and we'll get onto that later. On my grandfather's side, my mother's father's side, they came from a small village called Haddenham down in Buckinghamshire, and the family lived there for many years. My grandfather, who had quite an influence on me, he left school at the age of 8, and he left school to work on the land, picking stones out of the fields, scaring birds, and driving the cattle from down in Adnam by a sort of a drove road down into Uxbridge, which is basically where London Airport is now. That was his life as a small man, as a young man. I'm not sure how he met my grandmother, but basically at some point in time he moved from Adnam into Uxbridge with basically the rest of the family. Now I do have, I think, his birth certificate at home somewhere, and on it is the cross for his mother because she couldn't write. So as a young man, he had a family, and suddenly he's transposed to the Somme, to the mud and the death and that sort of thing. My grandmother, with the children, didn't have a penny to buy a newspaper to see how the war was going. And that was the situation. He came through the Somme unscratched, but I remember him telling me about how they were up to their knees in mud, and the officers used to ride by on horses, make a move, man, make a move. He was disciplined for shaving his upper lip because that was forbidden in the army at that time. Men had to have a moustache. He was so young and so immature, he didn't have any whiskers. He came back, and their family then moved down to a row of cottages in Hayes called Ship Row, and they basically were a few yards from the canal, the Grand Union Canal, and they saw the old working barges go down into London and back up to Birmingham and that sort of stuff. Outside toilets, running wild in the evenings, that sort of thing. So my grandfather then had, I think, 5 sons and 3 daughters. When I remember it, we lived in this fairly new estate that had been built. The estate was built new, but the men who designed it had old views. There were old men building new houses. For example, they didn't believe in inside toilets. So we had a newish house built 10 years ago with a toilet built at the back in an alcove. And inside the single kitchen, there was a huge room for the coal to be dumped. So basically, your coal was dumped in a hole in the kitchen. There was a bathroom in there without a wash basin, but with a bath, and the whole of the heating of that house was done with a fire, and they actually had the old-fashioned cast iron fireplaces with little knobs that actually handled your kettle and that sort of stuff. So that was where I was brought up there. The family of 3 girls and 7, 6, 5, whatever they were, sons, lived all together in the one sort of community, as it were. On my mother's side, on my father's side, he never really knew, as I say, his sisters and his brothers. He went into the army, and he then went, strangely enough, into a regiment called the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. He was London born, and they put him in a Scots regiment. So he went up there, and they wore the kilt in the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. And as you stepped out of the door of the barrack rooms, you had to step over a mirror so that the sergeant could see you were not wearing anything under your kilt, believe it or not. They used to, when they got over the mirror, have these long grey shirts, and they would actually pull them up into a sort of a nappy. From the army, he was a regular, obviously. He learnt sort of a bit of discipline, but certainly how to look after himself. He always had his shoes polished, he always had his trousers pressed. He went to Ireland, and at that time there were troubles in Ireland, and I remember he said to me it was the last place you wanted to be because the Black and Tans would shoot you in the back. He then finished up in India as just an ordinary soldier in the heat, the sort of soldier that, you know, Tommy Atkins and that sort of stuff is described with plunker-wallers and that sort of thing. But I don't know when he came out or how he came out. But he then had a job, and it was about the time of the Depression, I suppose, where he worked, I think, and I find this difficult to believe, for a company called in Southall in West London called the Gas, Light and Coke Company. They made, as you would expect, gas, light and coke. And they had, as he said to me at the time, lorries driven by coke and steam, almost like steam engines on the road. So I think he did a bit of driving there. But it was at a time when you would queue up outside the docks and men would throw tokens to you to get some work. It was also a time where most districts had a brass band and a park, and a brass band played and that sort of thing. I don't know how he married my mother or where, but they finished up in Hayes. He was always an outcast from my mother's side of the family. For example, they came from farming stock and they could grow anything. He had no family, he'd never had a garden, he couldn't grow anything. He never had a bike, he couldn't ride a bike, that sort of thing. Had no skills, never earned more than £5 a week in his whole life. So we were poor, but we were poor with everybody else that was poor in the street. There were no cars obviously about at that sort of time. We played in gangs, streetwise, really good. We would have things like bread and butter, but the poorer members would have eventually bread and marge and eventually bread and lard. It was that sort of thing, but we didn't know we were poor. So I've got no problems, no worries about that sort of school life there. On my father's side, Pugh is a Welsh name, and it originated, I think, on the Welsh borders. There are still relations down there of the Pughs, I believe. Somehow, my father's father, my grandfather, who I never met, came to London and became a milkman in sort of Marylebone, that sort of area. My father's mother, I've got some photographs of her on the album there, she was an Essex girl all the way through. You know, the name is Essex, she lived in Essex, and I don't know how she married him. But there's one story, and I can believe it, that she was going out in her finery, and she had a new hat on, and somebody spat, and it went on her hat, and she put him on the deck with one punch. She was an Essex girl. Now, these are the things that you don't get sort of in the family history. She then, as I say, had several children, and she put them in and out of care. Of the children, when you look at the history of it, there is one called on the charts, Violet Pugh. You search back and we never had a Violet in the family. We had Ivy and Emmy and Bert and such like. And in fact, Peggy, who we all knew as Auntie Peggy, she was actually christened Violet but lost the name Violet, and so you search for Violet, you never find her, but Peggy pops up all over the place. She lived with her sister called Emmy, and they worked basically in Southall in the Huntley and Palmer, I think, biscuit factory most of their life. They were a couple of old spinsters. Emmy died fairly early on with cancer, and sadly Peggy was a chirpy little bird, and she never had a home of her own. She lived with this brother, this sister, this sort of thing, all the way through her life. I lost touch with them for about 40 years, and eventually I drove down to Norfolk to make touch with them, and she opened the door and she was as she was 40 years ago. It was totally amazing. She lived to be something over 100, never had anything other than a single room of her own. So my father had no real skills. He was born in 1901, so he really missed the Great War. He had a brother, Bert, Albert, who was 3 or 4 or 5 years older, and he actually went into the Great War. Now, I've heard it, and I can hardly believe this, that he was a sniper in the Great War, and if snipers were captured, they were shot, so they immediately ripped off the band showing they were a sniper. Why anybody would want to advertise the fact that they were a sniper in the first place, I don't know. Anyway, he was, I think, the single brother of my father, and he made a bit of good. My father never owned a house, but lived in the outskirts of London somewhere. He bought his own house, and he became working on the buses with the tickets and that sort of thing. Like my father, he was a musician, and he set up a little band in the evening, a little dance band, and made quite a nice living for himself. He had 2 children and a wife, and he really dominated them. The wife was always in sort of patched clothes, that sort of stuff, Auntie Margaret, really nice, but Uncle kept the pennies. Of the 2 children, Raymond and Daphne, they both lived at home. Raymond then went into the army to do his national service. He was kept down by his father, and when he came out of the army, instead of escaping, he came back to his father. Daphne lived, she had a bit of a cast eye. She lived with the dad's mum as well. And eventually, Bert retired to a very nice little bungalow down in Norfolk. He took the children with him. So they all moved down to Norfolk, and they all lived in this cottage, or bungalow in Norfolk, and he had a few shillings then. He eventually died, the mother died, and Daphne and her brother lived together in one of the cottages. Eventually, Daphne met some fellow, and she married him down in Norfolk. And I've got a couple of sisters with a wicked sense of humour. And the guy that Daphne married had maybe a club foot or something like that. He sort of used to limp about. And they made their money going around fairgrounds, running fairground stalls. Daphne and her man living fairly close to her uncle, to her father in the next street. So Daphne had actually broken away to some degree. Sadly, Limpy got dementia, and Daphne describes to me, sadly, how one Christmas Eve he looked at her, walked out and walked under a lorry and killed himself. So that then left Daphne living in a nice cottage, nice bungalow, with her brother living in a second bungalow. And then it went on like that, and I sort of made contact at that point. She's a little bit, well, very much unworldly. And suddenly I had a letter from her written on a stenographer's sort of notebook, ripped out. Raymond had died. I never thought Raymond would die, she said to me when I drove down there. The fact that he had bowel cancer and bladder cancer was nothing to do. So she then finished up with his bungalow, her dad's savings, her savings, living by herself. I made a little bit of contact, but it's a long way down. At some point in time, what we've called travellers made contact with her. Hello, madam, cut your lawn, do this, do that. She's unworldly. They took her for 90,000 quid. That was my money, because I'm the only. Okay. So that's that side, was it. But she also had Peggy living with her at that time. So when Raymond died, there were really no mourners except 2 or 3 of us that went down to the funeral. And then suddenly, before the funeral came, she says to me, David, she says, I've got a guy who's got in touch with me through the Salvation Army, who says he's a relative of ours. I said, a relative of ours? She says, yes. I said, well, don't let him visit, but have a talk to him. So it occurs that my father has got a couple of sisters, and a mother, and a brother Bert, and there's another elder sister. And for some reason, these sisters fell out over a young man. So the eldest sister of all storms away from the family, and they don't hear from her again. And then suddenly, a few years ago, this guy pops up and says, I'm related. So the sister who stormed away from the family got married, I believe, and had a son who worked as a scaffolder. Didn't have a lot of education, but grafted hard, became a scaffolder. Eventually, his father died, his mother died. He wasn't computer literate. By writing and footfall and travelling, he discovered Daphne. And so Daphne and I suddenly found we had a cousin that we'd not known about, and he had a couple of relatives, myself and Daphne. His name was John, and he lived, believe it or not, no more than 5 or 6 miles from here. He lived in Waltham Abbey in a sort of caravan estate. Lovely guy, and he came to the funeral. So there was suddenly somebody else that popped up, and we sort of kept in touch. So there's that side of the family. Apart from that, Daphne is still alive. She lives by herself. She's got a few cats, and she's been through breast cancer and all sorts of things with no support, and she just gets on with life, a bit dim, but that's the way it goes with her. We pop down and see her very occasionally. Now, on my school side, no one had passed the 11 plus. I didn't pass the 11 plus, and I went to a secondary modern school. And we were all then designed for becoming gardeners and all that sort of stuff. About that time, the Education Act came in, and they produced comprehensive schools. So my school became from a secondary modern, not a sink school, but to a school where people were expected to take exams. My parents had no money really, and it was standard to leave school at 14. Somehow they kept me on, and I stayed at school the extra year or so, and I stayed on until I was 16. and I took some GCSEs. Now remember, with GCSEs, they were a 5-year course. We had, as a group of kids, a year to pack it in, all this information. I'd actually took the exams, and I took 2 English and I think 3 science, and I passed the 2 English exams. And that was my education as I left. Now, when I was about 13, 14, something like that, the estate I lived on and the street I lived in, somehow I made contact with a guy. He was about some years older than me, and he ran a scout group. His name was David Wyatt, and I joined his scout group. And he was responsible for me for getting into camping and climbing and the outdoor life. Not only that, we got on well together. He introduced me to music and all sorts of stuff. And in fact, he was best man at our wedding, I think. So I got on pretty well with him. And he advised me on getting jobs and all sorts of stuff. I eventually, by writing with his help, got a job at ICI, Imperial Chemical Industries, at Slough. That was about an hour's bus journey from me. My employment at that time was really working in the labs, more than bottle washing, but as an assistant. My salary at that time was £156 a year, £3 a week. Of that money, £1 went to my mum for my keep, £1 went to me for whatever, and £1 went for meals and travelling. So I joined ICI at Slough. Now I came from a poor background with no culture really. We had no books in the house, things like that. I joined an organisation where they took the top men from Oxford and Cambridge every year and recruited them to work in the labs. And I was working with these guys, and they were some of the brightest guys in the country. And below them, there were guys like me who were the sort of bottle washers and runners about and doing experiments. But these guys came from Windsor and Eton, and they'd all been to grammar school. So it was a bit of an eye-opener for me to see things like people using 2 utensils to eat their sweet. I'd never seen stuff like that, you know. A spoon and a fork. Yeah, I didn't let on, but it was a different culture. They'd been to grammar schools and I'd been to what was in the end a secondary modern. I kept my end up, and ICI were particularly good with further education. They expected you to carry on whatever. So they supplied all books and equipment and that sort of stuff. And you were then working 5 days a week for ICI, but one of those days you went to the local college. You worked there from 9 until 5 on various, just a local further education college, and then you worked that evening and another evening. So you did 1 day and 2 evenings a week studying, not for a degree, but a thing called a National Certificate in Chemistry. It was hard graft because there was no getting away from it. You had to get a certain percentage of attendances in. You had to get a certain percentages of homeworks in. You had to get a certain percentage of coursework in. And then after that work every day, I then had an hour's journey travelling home by bus. So it wasn't easy. But I got my ONC, and then it was just about time for national service. And I foolishly went in and did 2 years national service. I could have got away with it, but I didn't. And that's another story. I came out from national service, and I was then recruited or went back to ICI, and I then carried on doing my studies to do the higher national certificate in chemistry, which was a 2-year course, again, a day a week and a couple of evenings. By this time, I was fairly well known within the research department. And when I went back, they said to me, "David, nice to have you back. We're going to put you into a tiny lab with a guy called Maurice Thompson." And I said, "Fine, I don't know Maurice." And they said, "Well, be prepared to be shocked." As a young man, he was at Oxford, in the army, doing a degree. The war came, being officer material, he went into the tank corps. Now, in the tank corps, as an officer, he was in charge of 2 tanks. He went into the battle, Alamein, I think, and the front tank got hit. He went in and got the driver out. It's like, burned himself to smithereens. He had no hands, he had no face. And I worked with him for a couple of years. And we got on well. It's just, a side thing. Anyway, I got on well, and eventually I became assistant to the chief scientist there, and we got on particularly well. And I enjoyed it. In so much I enjoyed it. I once said to him, I'd come and work here for you for nothing. I enjoyed it so much. But I was getting married, we needed a house, and I then moved about from ICI, had various jobs, and finished up eventually marrying Jean and living down in Harlow here. And by that time I got my HNC in chemistry. Now, it's not a degree, it's inferior to a degree. And they then said, if you do another year, you will finish up with equivalent to a past degree. So I did the extra years college, and at the end of it all, they said, "Oh dear, we buggered it up. That wasn't quite a good enough qualification." But that was it.
Yes.
So that side of it, I finished up working down for various firms in the chemical industry around in Harlow. I worked for Smith and Nephew, who make, at that time, various things. They had a textile company, they had a company that made protection for women's sort of periods and that sort of stuff. They had a pharmaceutical company, they had a plastics company. And while I was there, Shell came to them and said, "We've invented a new sort of plastic. It involves using ordinary plastic polypropylene, but weaving it into a cloth. Now, you as Smith and Nephew have got the weaving technique. You do massive amounts of weaving in Lancashire, and you've got the plastics technique, which you do here. Now, that technique is unique to you, and we would like you to work with us on developing this plastic." And I was, at that time, on the commercial side, and I was a big buddy with the top man of Smith and Nephew. He liked me. He was a motor racing driver and, a bit of a man about town. And he said, "David, I like you for various reasons." And I ran that department, and he'd put his, not life on the line, but his reputation on the line that we would get this thing running. And 2 days before it was running, it all collapsed. And I went up to Manchester to work in a mill, and I worked for like 36 hours non-stop and got it running. So when all the department heads, managers came round to watch it, it was working well. He owed me. And every year, Smith and Nephew sent a certain number of people on a management course. There were 12,000 people in the company, and they sent 1 or 2 from each division to do a management course, and it lasted 6 months. So I went up to be interviewed in a great big building up in Temple Place in London, and I was given one of the places. In fact, there were 6 places, and they only chose 4 of us. So I travelled around the country doing various management, looking at people, meeting people, that sort of stuff. And at the end of it all, I went to Ashridge Management College. Now, Ashridge is a huge house in Hertfordshire, and it was owned as part of the estate of Queen Elizabeth I, so it dates way back. And it had been taken over as the premier management college of the country. As I stress, a management college and not a business college. So we were taught management and all sorts of stuff there. And that was basically pretty well the end of my 6 months at that college. I spent the last few days there, and I was then due to go to work with the very top man in Smith and Nephew for a couple of weeks. He was a member of the stock exchange, he owned Lowry's and that sort of stuff, and I would have sat and worked with him. And the night before I was due to go there to work with him, Unilever made a big bid for Smith and Nephew. So I never actually made it, sitting next to him. So I went back to do my job. And it was always a criticism of the management that of Smith and Nephew. You train these guys up, they're top-notch guys, you train them to do various things, then you put them back in their old job, and they're never satisfied. They expected something more, and they never got it. They'd offered me a job, actually, running the contact lens department. At some point in time, Seymour, the top whiz kid, he'd gone to America, and he'd met a person out there who developed a plastic, like Perspex, a hard plastic. But this plastic would absorb water or absorb moisture and become sponge and jelly-like. And they found out there that they were going to use it for prosthetic breasts. So you can machine the breast, you put it into a body, and it then absorbs the water and becomes soft. It was going fairly well, but not particularly well. Then somebody had the idea, why don't we do it with contact lenses? Because at that point in time, contact lenses, they were hard little discs that you put in your eye, and it took half an hour for your eye to stop watering. With these things, they made soft contact lenses. You made the lens hard, you could form it, you softened it in a liquid, you popped it into your eye like a jelly, and that was it. They wanted me to actually run this department. I hate managing people. At the time, we were making the contact lenses for 4p, and we were selling them for £40, which is something. Eventually, I got fed up and I left. I then went looking for jobs, and I went to a firm called Air Products. They were the American equivalent of British Oxygen. I was doing market research and looking at opportunities all over the place. And remember, I've only got this HNC in chemistry. They were advertising for somebody with a doctorate, PhD in chemistry. They had 40 applicants. Well, I went along and I sat down, and there were 3 or 4 people there. And I said, hello. I said, good morning, David. Blah, 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 blah. I said, now look, before we start this, I said, let's have a bit of honesty. I said, if you're not willing to pay me the sort of money that I want, then we're wasting our time, aren't we? And the guy said to me, Mr. Pugh, if you're the man for this job, we'll pay you whatever you want. And they did. They said, how much do you want? I forget what it was, thousands, you know. And I said, yeah, okay with that. I said, yeah. Now, at that time, people got company cars. Well, I didn't know, but the guy I'm putting the squeeze on owns a company helicopter. And I said, and a car? And he said, oh no, he said, what we do is we give you a sum of money, he said, And then if you want to buy a Jaguar with it, you buy a Jaguar. If you want to buy 2 Fords, one for you, one for your wife, that's what you do. So that was it. And I had various jobs in a department within this organisation. At one point, they rang me up and they said, Dave, and I said, yes. And they said, we want you to work in Paris. And I said, when? And they said, in the morning. So I went into the office in New Malden, and in the afternoon, I was working in Paris. There were various things. Shell were trying to break into the gas market, and a French company called Air Liquide was trying to break into Shell's market. There was a controversy over that. I used to travel to Paris every Monday morning and back every Friday night. We had 2 tiny children, Jean and I, and they said, well, the money you're spending, why don't you take your wife and your kids out? So we spent some time out in Paris with Jean. It all folded up when I came back to work in New Malden. Then I went out to Sweden to do some work out there, and it was a magnificent country. I spent a couple of weeks out there with the company, working in Stockholm and that sort of thing. And when I got back, the whole of my department had disappeared, and I didn't know what was happening. Eventually, towards the end of the day, the managing director rang me up and said, we've had a shift around, and I said, I can see that. He said, we haven't got a job for you. I said, I guess that. He said, how much do you want to go quietly? Just as he said, how much do you want to start? So I told him a large amount. Yeah, he said, no problem. Collected the cheque, put the cheque on the mantelpiece. Thought, I'll have a bit of a rest now, drop out, you know. About a month later, the phone rang. Hello, Dave. Hello, it's Hat Wagner. Yeah, I know, Hat. We've got a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, the guy we sent to Australia to sort the business out has messed it up. I said, I told you he would. He said, it's worth a lot of money to us. I said, I know it is. He said, we want you back. It's to sort it out. I said, I'm out of work. I'm out of a job. No way. He said, we thought you'd say that. We stopped your cheque. So there I am, with 2 children and a cheque on the mantelpiece worth thousands that have been stopped. So I said to him, right. I said, no, I'll be in your office in the morning. It was in New Malden. I used to travel into London and out of London every day. I said, and that money I want on your desk in notes at 10 o'clock. And he said, we can't do it. I said, that's your effing problem. Put the phone down, went down the next day to New Malden, big office block, went to the top floor. There was all the money on his desk. Collected it up, put it in my briefcase, went downstairs, paid it into the bank, went back up and said, well, that's lovely. He said, now will you work for us? I said, no. I said, well, I'll be a consultant for you. I said, and I can't remember the figures now because it was a long time ago. But it was the equivalent of £5,000 or £10,000 a day, I said. He said, you're joking. And I said, I never joke. And I walked out. Because what had happened was he knew that if he didn't pay me the money, I would go to the big competitor, British Oxygen, in London and tell them all that they were doing in Australia, and the deal was off. So they had to pay me. And so, of course, I had no method of getting another job or reference or anything like that. And eventually then I got into teaching, and I had good times and bad times in teaching. Moving back quite a bit, while I was working for Air Products, I was working quite a lot in London, and one day, while walking through London, I saw a crowd of people and a sort of a melee on the pavement. And I was a young man playing rugby, 2 tiny kids. When I got up to this melee, there was a man with an open razor holding the crowd back, and a man with an axe chopping another man in the head. I couldn't believe this. I went for them, they split up, I chased one and caught him and held him. And the story of why it all happened is a bit complicated. But basically, he ran, I caught him, the police arrested him, he went to prison. I never appeared at the trial. All our letters get opened, yours do, mine do. The letter saying come for the trial at the Old Bailey got down the back of the sofa, didn't it, Jean? And we never found it. Now, what had happened in the past was that in 1942, a man called Captain Binney, who was a captain in the Navy, was coming out of a shop. And as he came out of this shop, this jeweller's shop, he was passing the shop, and some robbers came out, and on their escape, they killed him. So Captain Binney was killed coming out of a shop. The shop was owned by the Goldsmiths Company. And the Goldsmiths Company are one of the great legends of the City of London. They date back 400, 500, 600 years. The Lord Mayors are elected from them. They wear their furs and their ermine. And because of this, it was a goldsmith shop. They set up an award for bravery in London. And it's some certificates and a medal every year for someone who has committed the bravest act or a brave act in London and isn't a member of the armed forces or the police. And I got an award. And for every year, we used to go up and see the new award winners. And they roll the gold out, and they wear their ermine, and sometimes Prince Charles goes there, and the Lord Mayor is there, and it's a grand occasion, and you can take a couple of visitors. So we've done that, or did that for many years, didn't we, Jean?
Yeah.
Taking various people up. About the time that I got this award, I had a letter, I think it was from Thatcher's office, and it said, the Queen has graciously awarded you the Queen's Commendation for Bravery for the same act, and it consists of a couple of tiny golden oak leaves, and it's awarded by the Queen for bravery, and they said, come to the palace and there'll be an investiture. Our children were very tiny, and we were going to Spain for the holiday. Gina's saved like mad. No way were we going to, give that holiday up. So I said to the palace, well, put it in the post. Couldn't do that to the Queen. Eventually, it finished up. We went on holiday, had a great time, and I went then down to Chelmsford to the Lord Lieutenant, who you probably know is the Queen's representative of the county, and got the award from him. And there's a photograph of it somewhere. So I then finished up with 2 awards, and that was known as the Brave Pew. It happened every year. Every year the award. I got too old, but even now, even last year, Jean and Gillian go along, and they've changed it a bit. And so now instead of in the evening, because everybody's getting a bit ancient, they have a grand lunch. I've always been a bit of a rebel in terms of, people not telling me what to do and such like. When I've turned jobs down, perhaps I shouldn't have turned down. But we've had a great life. Eventually I got into teaching. Didn't enjoy it very much. Had a few rows with headmasters and that sort of stuff. But got a lot out of it in terms of time off with my kids and climbing and camping and that sort of stuff. Children are now grown up. Gillian is a delight to me. America is St. John, living out there, living the life, and 2 gorgeous grandchildren. And here I am, sort of ticking over towards the end with no problems, no hesitation, no worries, and thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Go on, tell me it wasn't working.
Oh, sorry, I've just wiped it. 48 minutes, that's very good, well done. That's brilliant.
That was a rehearsal. Now, do you want me to run into the spiel properly?
He hasn't told
How was it, Jill?
so many
Good.
funny stories.
And that's really
Lovely.
for my grandchildren.
Yeah, that's lovely. lovely, Dad.
Bloody,
Really, really
bloody
nice.
aliens.
Yeah, that's super. I'll go and transfer this onto a USB stick. I'll either catch up with you before you head home tomorrow, or I'll bring it with me when I come out
Okay.
tomorrow. Okay, that's
Yeah.
nice.
So-
Is that all right?
Is that okay?
I'll check it.
I-
I'll have to go and plug it into the
I
computer.
love talking. I love it.
I love listening.
The more people, the better. You know, I mean, the most I've spoken to is maybe 200 or 300 people, something like that. Yeah. And as part of my management course, I did a course in public speaking. It's only one day, but it was invaluable. I thought there are all these people, 50, 60, 70, and they wanted someone to get up and speak. And I thought, well, I should never see them again. So I got up and I spoke. And there was all the hints, like when you get up, you don't tap the microphone. That's the mark of the
Yeah.
bloody amateur. You assume that it's working.
Yeah.
You talk to people, and then you stop. And they're all, why you stopped? And you bring their attention back.
Yeah.
You don't stand at the mic, you take a couple of steps this way, take a couple of steps that way. Simple things, but it makes all the difference to people sort of public speaking. Makes all the difference. And I love it. I really do. You remember the speech I gave at your wedding?
Yes, I do.
Loved it. You know, I just love but you've got to prepare. It's no good reading it off a script. You have your cards and there are keywords and that's it. You don't because that kills it. You've got a couple of words. You do prepare for a couple of nights before and you know what you're going to say and you turn the cards over.
Because you didn't even have your prompt
Yeah.
or anything. You just went out and it
Anyway,
was
so thank
beautiful.
you for
Lovely.
giving me the opportunity for doing this because I've loved it.
Lovely, Dad. Right, I'm going to turn this off now.